This session is part of the summer series, and a series which are a series of webinars that we're running through the summer term to support you through and beyond the coronavirus pandemic. We know that pupils have lost out on learning while schools have been closed, and that this will have the greatest impact on disadvantaged pupils who are expected to fall even further behind their wealthier peers. Pupils will have also fallen out of positive routines, they'll have picked up new habits and potentially experienced trauma as a result of the lockdown. The evidence shows us that to close the gap, we need to focus on what to teach and how to teach it. And I believe that this puts curriculum at the heart of the school's recovery. But these are unusual and uncertain times and are likely to continue to be. And so school leaders and teachers are going to be hard at work at the moment, thinking about how their curricula should respond to people's needs, what they should prioritise, and what should be avoided. This session is titled Curriculum After Closures, What Schools Should Prioritise. And I'm really excited to have such a fantastic and experienced lineup of panellists for our roundtable discussion today. Over what I hope to be a thought-provoking and stimulating hour, our panellists will discuss all of these problems and pose some ideas from their different contexts to help teachers and school leaders with their decision-making. I'm going to let them introduce themselves properly in a minute, but very briefly, we have David Benson, who is Principal of Kensington Aldridge Academy in West London. Elliot Costas-Walker, who is Assistant Trust Principal at Forward as One Academy Trust in Bolton. Dr. Helen Drury, who is Director of Curriculum Programmes at Art Curriculum Plus. And last but not least, we have Andy Wolfe, who is Deputy Chief Education Officer at the Church of Education Office. So thank you all so much for joining us today to tackle a really important topic for our teachers and school leaders at the moment. We have a lot of ground to cover in the next hour, and I'm looking forward to a really fascinating discussion. So without much further ado, I'll hand over to our speakers. I'm going to give each speaker 2 minutes just to give a more detailed introduction of themselves and to give their very brief opening statements. Let's go in the order that you appear on this introduction slide. So David, if we can, your introduction and 2 minutes opening piece on the topic of curriculum, please.
No problem, thank you, Melissa. So I'm head teacher of a school called Kensington Aldridge Academy, which is an 11 to 18 school in West London. It's a high-performing school on a good day, so it's outstanding in Ofsted terms, but it's best known for its proximity to the Grenfell Tower fire. The school's immediately next to Grenfell Tower, and people watching this will have seen my school because anytime you saw a picture of Grenfell, there's a big academy right next to it. And the school was badly affected by Grenfell, but it's playing a role in the broader recovery strategy. I think just very briefly, a few things to say about this. The first is just to acknowledge the speed at which things are happening. So, for example, yesterday the Prime Minister announced that there would be a significant programme of summer catch-up, which was a new piece of information with very little time to implement it, and actually no specific guidance on what it might look like. So, as leaders, any plans you have to have need to be held very lightly and need to be adaptable, and you need to only invest an appropriate amount of time in trying to anticipate or second-guess guidance or get ahead. That is a very unique challenge. But I think we need to have a can-do and positive approach to that, because if I think we turn around and say, nobody told us the exact arrangements for year 10 and year 12 face-to-face teaching until 2 weeks in advance, I mean, there are 8 million people on the furlough scheme who don't know if they're going to have a job to go back to in August or September. There are business owners who are facing existential issues about whether they can continue to operate. So the exact nature and amount of the year 10 to year 12 face-to-face teaching is just not really an issue when you think about it in those contexts. So we all have a part to play. Secondly, I think we need to acknowledge that home learning is deeply unsatisfactory, and people who say that it's okay because the home learning is really good are just missing the point. So, if you have a very high level of motivation, you're very highly organized, you're extremely independent in the way you approach your learning, so you don't have any special educational need, or you're not a middle or lower entertaining person. And if you have lots of stability and encouragement at home learning is okay. There's a lot of ifs in that sentence, right? So generally speaking, we need kids back to school, and the kind of hypocrisy that my students can go to a zoo, a theme park, a cinema, a restaurant and a shopping mall, but they can't come in and learn, is, I think, increasingly unraveling that position. And then two just very quick things. I think there's a risk that we elevate the importance of the mental health piece. You talked about it a lot in your introduction there, Melissa, and it's talked about quite widely in the sector. I'm not for a second diminishing how difficult it's been for students to be at home for such a long period. It's been very difficult for staff as well. And there's just an apprehension about coming back to work. And obviously there's a real risk that schools have faced bereavement in their community. But we need to start with a glass half full mentality. The kids are going to be very enthusiastic about coming to school. They're going to want to crack on with the curriculum. They're going to want to hit the ground running. If we say, well, hang on guys, we need to do a big recovery curriculum, let's put in a whole mental health thing, you know, and then we'll come to English and maths later, I think we risk that becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the last thing is, whatever we do in terms of resequencing the curriculum or flipping the learning around or whatever it is, it's the middle leaders in the organization who need to have as much autonomy and control over that as possible. I think if senior managers try and get into the weeds of that work, it's going to go really bad.
Thank you, David. Elliot, can I bring you in next?
Thanks very much, Melissa. I'm Elliot Costas-Walker, and I'm the Learning and Teaching Lead for Forwarders One Multi-Academy Trust. As Melissa said, it's a multi-academy trust of 7 schools in the northwest of England. It's a real honour to be invited to sit on this panel today and share my thoughts and my provocations around this matter, which I believe is the most important challenge which all leaders currently face in the country. And we're not alone in that. And I think what makes that such a challenge is there's no guide or handbook or webinar which is going to inform leaders in how to approach this for their communities and the communities that they serve. And that's the biggest challenge. When I reflect as a leader in a Church of England multi-academy trust, we've tried to view this as an opportunity for innovation and social connection. For example, utilising technology now more than ever than we've done in education before. But the alarming aspects and the figures and the statistics, as we've alluded to, speak for themselves. You know, despite everybody's best efforts throughout the country, and there's some fantastic national programmes, as David has alluded to, through the Oak Learning Academy and the online platforms, that the rapid evidence review that the EEF engaged in report that our disadvantaged children, their gap will widen broadly by 36%, which obviously reverses that progress which has been made as a country to narrow the gap since around 2011. And that was quite stark for me to realise that statistic, that broadly 36% gap would widen. Like Gavin Williams said, and the government have previously mentioned about education being on and off over the next few months and maybe even year. And I think at different points that could fluctuate for us. And as David quite rightly said, that's about us as leaders having the courage and being bold enough and being nimble enough to create a strategy, but also a curriculum that is fit for the community and the children that it serves, but that can respond to the emerging needs that we're presented with. And I think it's about linking in with that culture, that actually we need to see this as an opportunity, looking beyond that rainbow that we're currently all in, and looking at this as an opportunity for curricular innovation and to become better tomorrow than we were today. Our key principles at Forwarders One that we have built a framework around in order to support the social, emotional, mental health needs of our children and communities, but also, as David said, reignite their learning, their learning behaviours, and make best use of flipped learning and technology. The transparent curriculum is really important, and how we deliver our curriculum despite all of these challenges that we face. The final thing is really important to us as Church of England Matt is community, faith and service, and staying true to that and supporting our communities through this time.
Great, thank you,
you.
Elliot. Next up, Helen.
Thanks, Melissa. Hello, so I am Helen Drury, and as Melissa said, I'm the Director of Curriculum Programmes for ARC Curriculum Plus. And as an organisation, we're really passionate about taking the very best evidence and the most coherent curriculum design and making sure that every single pupil in every single classroom is really getting the benefits of that. So, I mean, I hesitate to use the term normal in education. I don't think there is ever a normal, but these times certainly are pretty unusual. But in any time, I think every subject, every lesson on a school's timetable is there with good reason. And now more than ever, we need to be really clear on the purpose of each kind of piece, each component of that curriculum. So we know that every child, regardless of their background, regardless of their context, has enormous potential. And so much of good curriculum design is really about entitlement. It's about thinking, what's the content and what's the disciplinary thinking, what's the skills that we want every young person to acquire and to develop. And in these circumstances, we've got to keep our ambitions for pupils really high, because as soon as we start making excuses and start to expect less of pupils due to the challenges that they're facing, there's a real risk that we let them down. And so I think we have to try and avoid making assumptions about which pupils this will have affected most and which pupils this will have affected in which way, and really think about kind of the huge wealth of evidence there is about what effective curriculum looks like and what effective pedagogy looks like, from kind of cognitive load theory through to all sorts of subject-specific studies. And we need to make sure that all of that evidence is still getting into our classrooms and benefiting those children's learning. So that hasn't changed what's important. I suppose it's made what's important an even greater priority than usual. I guess now more than ever, what we're needing is that kind of that coherent, that cumulative, that evidence-informed curricula, and really carefully considered progression in your content and your disciplinary thinking. And if teachers don't feel confident, if middle leaders, as David said, aren't confident that their teams are teaching the most important things in the most effective way, then that remains the most important place for them to start. So we're working with kind of over 5,000 primary and secondary schools, teachers, not schools, across the UK. And one of the advantages of them sharing that curriculum and the approach in the classroom is that there's the opportunity for them to share problems collaboratively and share resources and solutions. And what they are telling us are their sort of main priorities going forward are thinking about whether the maps of their curricula need to be shifted. So when the children do get back into the class in a substantive way, are we looking at kind of going back to when the school's closed and teaching the content from the start of summer? Or are we thinking about starting from the autumn, just with an awareness that there will be more gaps and misconceptions potentially? Thinking deeply about pupil organisation. So normally you've got often the same teacher, same classroom, and a continuity of learning experience. If children are going to be learning some things in school and some things at home, how do they kind of keep that sense of cohesion and make connections between the learning that they're doing? And then significantly, teacher development. A lot of teacher development happens by collaborating face-to-face in classrooms, by going to face-to-face training. We need to make sure that there's more opportunity for teachers to learn and develop now, not less. So I think in terms of priorities, firstly, making sure that your normal curriculum, whatever that is teaching the very best things in the very best way, considering where to start when schools do reopen for a year group. So you're going back or you looking forward, planning for how the pupils are going to connect their learning, and then really investing in professional development for teachers.
Lovely, thank you, Helen. Last but not least, Andy, could you introduce yourself and just give us your thoughts on this?
Hi, thanks, Melissa. My name's Andy Wolfe. I'm the Deputy Chief Education Officer for the Church of England, which means that I help to oversee the Church of England's network of about 4,700 schools across the country. That's about 20% of all schools, about a quarter of all primary schools. Prior to that, I was Vice Principal at the Nottingham Emmanuel School, which is a large secondary school in the centre of Nottingham, serving a very normal, diverse inner city community. I think these opening reflections from me, I think this situation, this season has heightened what all of us in education know, which is actually education is not simply about the what, but it's about the why. Our role in education is not simply to think, what do we need to do? What do we need to deliver, as if education was a kind of commodity to be delivered, but actually to think why we're delivering it and how we're going about that in a community. I totally agree with what David said around the vulnerability of online learning. It exposes huge social disadvantage, and generally we build it on massive cultural assumptions, which widen gaps rather than narrow them. And actually, it even raises questions of the nature of a school in the first place. If it could be delivered in this way, what is the actual point of community? And I know for my own children, they're engaging with online stuff, but they're longing for community. And that couldn't be a more, that's not a fluffy kind of just desire to see friends. It's actually a part of their identity and their formation. So as we go back, I think we need to be thinking carefully about that. We need to be thinking about the economic disparity that it's brought about. And I think particularly at the moment, that raises questions for character education alongside delivery of content. We know that character education is fundamental to a student's ability to learn and to progress and to believe in themselves and to ultimately achieve. So that's super important. And then finally, I think, all of us working in the sector at the moment, the current climate it's obviously not the first time school leaders will have thought about diversity and inclusion. But we can see in a lot of the coverage around that issue that frequently schools are kind of like used as a kind of, well, if only everyone had been taught better at school, we'd all understand history better and we'd have much better racial integration internationally, which again opens up this question of not just the what but the why. We could just all race to deliver more history content, more all of that, so just more packages of learning being delivered. But actually we need to educate students to not just have the knowledge but have the wisdom to use that knowledge well.
Lovely, thank you, Andy. Thanks very much for those introductions and thoughts, everyone, and for keeping for time as well. Before we move on, let me just tell you how the rest of this session is going to work. So to start the conversation off, I'm going to pose 3 of my own questions to the panel. In the interest of time, I'm not going to ask all of the panel to respond to each question. I'm going to target them to specific people. And then in about 10 minutes after all have spoken, I'm going to move on to asking some questions from the audience. So if you think you have a question, please do add it to the Q&A box for consideration. You can access that at the bottom of your Zoom window screen. So let's now come to our panel. My first question, which I'd like to pose to Andy and Helen, is what are the principles that guide your curriculum thinking in normal times that is particularly pertinent and important to remember now? Andy, let's come to you first. Your thoughts.
Thanks, Melissa. So yeah, the Church of England vision for education is kind of built around 4 areas: wisdom, knowledge and skills, hope and aspiration, community and living well together, and dignity and respect. And it's a vision that was published in 2016. If you just Google Church of England Vision for Education, it has been picked up, as you'd expect, by Church of England schools, but also we work with loads of community schools as well, because it's a vision for education, not just for church schools. And I think there's some really important points in there. The first around wisdom. This is not an anti-knowledge comment at all, but actually, in equipping young people with more and more knowledge and the retention of more and more knowledge, it's also incumbent on us to think about the wisdom to use that knowledge well. I mean, the last few days are a really good example of that, where that's played out massively across the world. I think in the second area, on hope and aspiration, I personally think that there's some real issues here around the blend of academic and vocational curriculum. We're spending quite a bit of time in this pandemic thinking about how other countries have responded to pandemic, and actually we might do well to think about how other countries have generally set up their education systems that don't necessarily create this false disparity between those two pathways. You know, we know that a broader curriculum allows more students to flourish, but yet we're a little bit in a race to a more narrow approach. The idea of community and living well together, you know, a lot of our work in that area is around the relationship between building character and the impact that has on achievement, and that isn't to suggest that everyone should have like character club on a Thursday afternoon, you know, where we all, you know, try and become more patient as a result of a lesson in patience, but actually that it needs to be embedded in our curriculum approaches, such that we recognize that the personal development of young people is integral to their progress, and probably is more important now than ever because they've been so isolated from one another. And then finally, the fourth area, dignity and respect. You know, those are two words which kind of often feel a bit meaningless, like just that, like they're being polite to one another, and we should, you know, that's how we treat one another with dignity. But actually, you know, the idea of dignity is placing the other person first. It's actually a permitting failure and things going wrong. And then still so if you're trying to learn something new, you have to get it wrong first, and you have to be able to recover. So those four areas are really, you know, really important in thinking about that why, not just the what.
Lovely, thank you, Andy. Helen, can I come to you now for your views on this?
Yeah, so I mean, I touched in the opening statement about the importance of ambition and on kind of really aiming high. And I think that resonates with what Dave was saying as well about that you just that it's important to offer a great curricular experience and a learning experience to students, whilst remaining aware that they have all sorts of challenges that they'll be dealing with. And it's not to he put it much better than I'm going to now, sorry, but it's not to underestimate the impact of that on them, but also to appreciate that a really ambitious education can be part of the solution, I guess. I think a second principle is around the evidence, and I think there's such a lot that we know as a profession, and there's such a lot of academic research and other evidence, and Elliot mentioned the Education Endowment Foundation, but there's a huge amount of evidence, and I think it's far too hard still for teachers and middle leaders to access that and to make it a reality in their classroom, and we really need to find ways of helping that to happen, which leads to a third, which is partnership, and I think trying to help and support teachers to be working together between schools and learning from each other, and it does feel a bit at the moment, perhaps because of the fast pace of the decision making and the announcements and the responding, that the individual teachers and individual schools are having to kind of rapidly come up with their own unique solution to things, and it would be great to be celebrating all the kind of partnership working that's going on, and where schools can be working together and supporting each other and sharing, which I know is happening, but I think that's vital. But I think so ambition and evidence and partnership, but the most important of all is the teacher. And I think you can have all of the aims in the world, and you can think very carefully about the detail of whether the priority is knowledge or it's wisdom or it's both. But as teachers, where are we getting our wisdom and where are we getting our knowledge? And we can't suddenly assume that all of the practitioners in all of the schools, because we've decided that one of those things, or both of those things, I hope, are important, that they're going to have it too. And we need to make sure that they are being given opportunities to learn and to develop and become wise about things. And in the current context, where there's a lot of thinking about race and diversity, understandably, making sure that there's opportunities for the teaching community, the profession, to learn and develop their understanding and their wisdom about that, as well as thinking about what that curriculum experience might look like for the students.
Great, thank you, Helen. really important for us to consider at the moment, that issue of diversity when it comes to our curriculum strategy. And I'll be interested to see if we have any questions later from our audience on this. Thanks for that. So the second question I'm now going to ask to Elliot and David is, does your curriculum need to be revised in light of school closures to close gaps in learning, particularly for disadvantaged pupils? Elliot, can you start us off with this question, please?
Absolutely. Thanks, Melissa. I think it's important to recognise, first of all, that schools have been partially closed, and actually school leaders and teachers across the country have been working incredibly hard over this period to make sure that the most vulnerable children and all children can still access learning, and that their pastoral needs are met, and that families in our community are supported. In response to your question, Melissa, I think it's a process. And I think the first step in that process for school leaders across the country is reflection, and not just ad hoc reflection. I think it's deliberate and deep reflection that involves a range of key stakeholders, parents, children, teachers, across the board, to think about what has worked effectively during this period for them as a school and as an organisation. What are their successes? You know, what have they done incredibly well? What have they managed well for their children and their communities? And also going to Andy's point about how and why have they managed to do that? And also, what are their even better ifs going forward? If we're in this phase for quite some time, what do they need to focus on to improve about their curricular offer or their approach to supporting children's learning at home and remotely? So I think reflection is really important, that deliberate and deep reflection, not just school leaders, but using a range of stakeholders in that process. The second step, I think, is self-evaluation. And I think that's quite a critical and honest evaluation about the provision that is currently being offered to children, whether they be at home or in school. We talk about we hear about vulnerable children, and actually one of our head teachers made the really astute point about calling them valuable children. They are all children are valuable, but they are really valuable to ensure they do not become lost in this, and that their learning, like David said, is prioritised, and that their social and emotional needs are also met, but actually we have high expectations for learning and for progress as well. So I think it's self-evaluation in terms of engagement of home learning, and what impact does that have? You know, what impact has that had over this period, and how do parents feel about that home learning? What does that look like in terms of that offer? And I think the third step is about prioritization, and it's about thinking, why this, why now, but also what next? And I think in terms of our own leadership behaviours around that, it's about that bold and courageous leadership, because they are big, courageous decisions to be made in terms of what is best for a community and what is best for children who attend a school. And I believe that as leaders, we know our children, we know our schools, and we know our communities better than anyone else. And it's about using our vision and our values that you hold dear as a school leader, and incorporating that through curricular approach. In terms of the granular aspects of the curriculum, our approach in terms of moving forward as one, you know, beyond the rainbow, we have prioritised social, emotional, mental health and well-being first, because children can't assimilate their learning if their primary needs and learning behaviours aren't there. And obviously children have been, some of which have been in school and some at home. How do we actually induct children back into the appropriate learning behaviours, and how do we prioritise them and also nurture so they are ready to learn and they're in a position to learn and move forward? Moving on from that, in terms of curriculum, early reading and early maths, especially across the primary phase, looking at phonics first, but also reading fluency, because we know that is the gateway to the curriculum, and that has to be prioritised. Early maths is really important. I think with the maths element, it's about that progressive approach to concepts and looking at those key curricular components, as Helen referred to, and identify which need to be prioritised. we can't do everything all at once. We need to be really deliberate and really focused in what we prioritise and how we prioritise that. And school leaders are in the best position to be able to do that.
Great, thank you so much, Elliot. Coming to you now, David, your perspective on this question as well, please.
Yes, so if the question is, does the curriculum need to change? I think no is the answer in terms of the content and the vision of the curriculum, because that is a considered long-term thing. And we heard two visions for curriculum from Andy and from Helen, and there wasn't a lot that I would disagree with in both of those. And I don't think you need a wholesale change of that. I think that would be a disservice to the kids. But we do need to think about the delivery model for that curriculum and how that's going to change. And the challenge is that we don't have any real clarity over what the autumn term looks like. So we have to think as leaders, what do we know? So I think it's fair to say that more of the transfer of the key knowledge will take place at home. So just acquiring the knowledge within the specification or whatever it is something that can more easily happen independently. Not easily, but more easily. And then the face-to-face contact that we have in school becomes about transforming that knowledge that's being transferred separately into higher level evaluative or analytical thinking or whatever it is. That's the best use of the time that we have in school, I think. I think that we know that there's going to be more kids in school than there are now in the autumn term, but that some element of distance learning will still persist. And I think that we know that exams will happen in 2021. I think they've been pretty clear on that. And I just think it's so complex, this centre assessed grade, in terms of the fairness of it and how students and parents are going to react. And it's just not good to say, well, you can take an exam in September if you don't like the grade, because if I haven't been taught from March to September, then I'm obviously significantly disadvantaged by that, unless I have a private tutor or something. I think Helen gave us some really good things to think about now that we could be talking to teachers about. So, for example, how does teacher development work when there isn't as much face-to-face collaboration? In autumn, do we start looking forward, perhaps occasionally plugging gaps through interventions, or do we spend a month or two going back over March to July? And how do we keep continuity? I mean, in our school, we hate split classes between teachers because they create a lack of continuity, but this is like, that times a million. And the last thing I'd say is that I do think that some kind of diagnostic testing about who's coped well with home learning and who hasn't is going to need to take place. And some kind of remedial work will need to be targeted at those students who've perhaps fallen behind, and that might be taking place after school or at the weekends or in the holidays. And I think that there's a danger that we're sort of bullied into thinking that can't happen because of teacher well-being or teacher workload. I mean, I don't know about other people, but I just didn't recognize the survey results that the major teaching unions were quoting at us in April and May about the return to work. And they were saying, only 5% of teachers want to go back, or only 10% of teachers want to go back. I mean, I spoke to a number of teachers who said they weren't reading their union emails anymore because they found them sort of hyperbolic. And we did a poll here in the middle of that time, and we had 65% say that they didn't want to come back despite everything that was happening because they listened to the government advice. So you could almost flip that on its head, and you could say, I mean, Elliot is completely right that the leadership are exhausted and we need a summer holiday. But in a large school like mine, I have 200 staff in my school. I do have some teachers who haven't been at full capacity for quite a long amount of time. And if I was able to pay them over the summer, perhaps a day rate of £75 or £100, and say to them, I'd like you to coordinate a week's worth of catch up for year 9 before they start their GCSEs in year 10. You could almost argue that as a positive for their well-being. You could say, here is a really interesting professional project for an NQT or an RQT, and here's some remuneration with it, and you've got some delegated authority for it. And it might help with catch-up. So I think I can see a big row coming about catch up in the summer and about after school intervention and about stuff at the weekend. And I don't think that needs to be a big polarizing row with academy chains saying that we're going to do lots of stuff because our teachers are younger and more and have a better work ethic, and everyone else saying that that's. I think we, you know, that in other countries that whole piece around catch up is just much more. There's much more consensus about it.
Great, thank you so much, David. I'm going to ask one more question. I'm going to just come to Helen for this question, if that's okay, and then we're going to move to the audience. Helen, what is the role of school leaders in facilitating the culture, teamwork and trust, or what we might call the enabling conditions, for schools to implement revised or existing curricula in this context?
It's interesting just having heard what David was saying. So I think one of the priorities is thinking about teachers and their workload and their well-being. And I think it's particularly difficult at the moment because obviously with all the remote working that is happening, it becomes more challenging for school leaders and middle leaders to be aware of what people are doing and how they are using their time. And so I guess just being incredibly purposeful with everything that's being decided and really clear about the why. Because I think in this profession, people are always happy to rise to a challenge if they're really clear on why something is being done. And so if we can be clear about what the anticipated impact is of what's happening, then I think that's fine. And I suppose, yeah, connected to that, for every decision that's being made, thinking about how we'll know that it's having the impact we've intended on learning. So if there is an additional week for year 9, how will we know that that has been time well spent? Is there a way that we can check whether it's had that outcome? And if we find that it hasn't, what will we do then? So I think just being really, really clear with all the decisions that we're making, yeah, what the why is, and what success will look like.
Great, thank you, Helen. So thanks for kicking off the conversation. I'm going to now turn to our audience for some questions, and we've had lots of questions coming through. I'm going to pose one to Andy that's come from our audience for you, Andy. On return, how do you envision you will give middle leaders autonomy over how they deliver their curriculum?
That's a great question, actually, and not least because you know, some of the stuff that we're talking about is not simply about how the effective delivery of each piece of the curriculum is enacted. That's one of the challenges of online learning, because the whole curriculum obviously appears in pieces in a much more most online delivery, you choose what subject, it's a different box on the screen, isn't it? And that interdisciplinary stuff is absolutely crucial, you know, not least because feelings in this area will run strong. You know, most teachers are pretty committed to their subject and in secondary, and pretty committed to those curriculum strands. So the need for dialogue between middle leaders is where I think the autonomy can come from. I think lots of autonomy may actually not be super helpful, because it may almost produce parallel existences for students in different subjects and in different year groups. And I think that's why those vision points are so important, alongside the notion of caring for young people, and not assuming that when we arrive back in a normal learning environment that it will just be a week or two before students readjust. I mean, the trail of this will be for a long time. You know, it won't be just for the first few weeks while we get back to the, you know, in the life of an 8-year-old. This is a big chunk of life that has been, you know, it's majorly disruptive. If you think about how it feels as an adult, it feels disruptive enough. But so I think that autonomy can come, but only really in dialogue, such that the school itself has like a clarity of vision about what it's trying to do.
Thank you, Andy. I'm going to come to you now, Elliot. We've had a question, or a few questions on this point. So this is obviously an area that people are really thinking about. What kind of initial ideas have you for supporting students' wellbeing and mental health?
Really important area, I think, in terms of the social and emotional mental health. I referred to, how we've discussed our children as valuable children. And I think that recovery approach through trauma, we're not aware of what our individual children and what our families have faced over the last few months. And the significance of that may have an impact over time. And I think looking at principles around social and emotional mental health and prioritising learning behaviours, resilience, but also equipping children with the vocabulary that they need to be able to share their thoughts and feelings around this matter is really important to me. I think it's really crucial as well that we foster a climate where children have that vocabulary to be able to self-regulate both their own learning behaviours, but their own thoughts and feelings as well, in order to be ready to learn. And as effective as we can in getting that social and emotional mental health strategy through the curriculum and onboarding our children back, I think the readiness we will have in terms of beginning curriculum teaching more effectively and beginning to build upon in our curriculum. And I think that's really important language to use, that actually in terms of catching up, that sounds very different to building upon. And I think our focus definitely is building upon the learning that the children were engaged in before lockdown, not trying to quickly catch them up, because I think that's when you may teeter into dangerous territory in terms of gaps in learning and not understanding learning as a whole construct. So I think it's building upon that learning and giving the children the tools to be able to do that effectively.
Lovely, thank you, Elliot. Really interesting insights there. We've had some questions come through from our Future Leaders cohort, which have already shaped some of the questions that I've been asking. But one additional question that they've asked to hear from our panel, which I don't think we've covered yet, is what do we do about the current Year 10 and 12 students who have not learned during the school closure but still have exams to sit in 2021, and how do we balance this consolidation with ensuring that students have learnt enough of the course to not be disadvantaged when sitting the 2021 exams? David, I'll come to you for this question, if I may.
I think that the exam boards, I'm not in the game of making predictions. I think that's a mug's game right now, but I think it's fairly safe to say that the exam boards will tell us something in the autumn term about the 2021 exam series, and some kind of adjustment might be made, and then we can work towards that. But I think essentially it's the things that I've talked about, which is resequencing the curriculum and thinking that through, allowing the middle leaders to own that process, working with families of schools to learn from each other, and then thinking about targeted catch-up work deployed in line with the capacity that you have. There's just a couple of things, Melissa, that I wanted to come back on if I can, because I've worked out that there's this Q&A button, which I've never seen before, and a lot of people are asking some really good questions. So if I could just take literally 30 seconds on that.
Absolutely, go ahead.
Okay, so I want to clarify that someone said, am I bashing trade unions? I want to clarify that I fully understand the cautious approach that the trade unions were taking in order to protect their members. Of course I do. And I am just as frustrated as anyone at the government's mishandling of this in the sector of communication and in other areas. If I sound frustrated, I'm frustrated with all sides, because schools have been placed in, head teachers have been placed in an impossible position, and government bodies have been placed in an impossible position. We can't keep everyone happy. It's actually been really, really hard. So I'm not blaming anyone, but I'm saying I think this could have been handled better, is what I'm saying, and I understand the difficulties. The second is, teachers have worked incredibly hard in a large number of cases, but what I'm saying is we shouldn't take the idea of summer work or catch-up work off the table on that basis, because in some cases there may be capacity within some schools, and no two schools are the same, and we should be careful about criticising other schools because everyone's got different circumstances, different buildings, different staffing capacities. And someone said, you know, why would you want a newly qualified teacher or an RQT helping with the year 9 catch-up? Wouldn't you want a more experienced person? Of course you would want a more experienced person. Of course I would like someone who was more established, and it's certainly not a criticism of older teachers or younger teachers. It was just a point that some people might have more appetite for working in that way. And the last thing around catch-up funding, I think, you know, because I said that paying teachers for summer and weekend work would be a good idea. I think that the DfE have already said that we can bid for small amounts of additional contingency funding for costs that are incurred as a result of COVID. And it may be that some schools have more resource to make those kind of bids, but that is there on the table. And I think we're talking about a very small amount of money to do some catch up over the summer, which could potentially be found from existing savings within school budgets, because we've just spent less on reprographics, resources, other areas. I hope that clarifies some of those things.
Lovely, thank you, David. Just a question coming through, Andy, which I'll pose to you. In light of the fact that many pupils will have been out of school for a long period of time, what do you think the first 2 weeks of school should look like for these children?
That's a great question. Actually, if I'd had my microphone on, you would have heard my daughter tapping at the window, who's just come back from she's back in year 6 this week. And it's been fascinating to see the range of stuff that they've been doing as a school. Obviously, blending wisely, some pretty straight maths and English provision with some relationship building and some bringing back together of a community. And I think that there's an understandable rush and panic, and I particularly empathise with the point about year 10 and 12. I mean, if I think of the normal GCSE classes that I would have been teaching, the thought of having this chunk basically missing of trying to deliver the full specification really complex. But I think those first 2 weeks have got to focus on a sense of belonging and attachment in a community, which will have been lost. I think it's maybe different for different age groups in terms of how those relationships reconnect, and some, that has particular implications, I think, for children who have experienced trauma earlier in their lives. I think that I don't know how many schools would be familiar with working from a kind of attachment theory base on that, but I think that's really important, because it's not simply just a disruption that's inconvenient and we weren't in the building. For many children, this kind of disruption evokes all kinds of other things which open up. And I think we need to be kind to one another as we do that. As David's suggesting, like teachers and head teachers and senior leaders have been really stretched through this situation. And I think there's a fear that whenever the kind of return comes, that you kind of need to go on the B of the bang, so it's all the most efficient. Literally every second counts, because we've lost so much time. Well, we know that unless there are, without flourishing adults, there will be no flourishing children in schools. And so we need to be kind and gracious to one another, and really invest wisely in the well-being of staff, as well as thinking, right, we've got a job on to catch up. I'm not sure that's a very prescriptive 2 weeks, but I think there's a few ingredients that might be useful there.
Lovely, thank you, Andy. And just a final question, and I'll pose this to you, Helen. There's been talk of using this challenge as an opportunity to innovate. Are there any common aspects or approaches to school curriculum that you'd particularly like to see change or be left behind? Just a very quick response to that, if you can. Not easy.
So I think that over the last few years, there have already been schools doing lots of deep curriculum thinking, and I don't think that there's any sort of new or different principles that have come out of the school closure period. I think it's heightened awareness, hasn't it, of, you know, the challenges of digital and use of technology, which we knew about, of the importance of really making sure that curriculum offer doesn't shut doors or close opportunities for any children, which I think can sometimes be a risk. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I'd be reluctant to say that it's a kind of an opportunity for major innovation, but there's been talk of the importance from Elliot about reflection and self-evaluation. And I think, yeah, sort of just taking the time to make sure that you're really, really confident about what the key content and disciplinary skills are in the subject that you're teaching is even more important now than ever.
Lovely, thank you, Helen, for that brief response to what was quite a large question in the given time I gave you. Thank you all. I'll wrap us up there. Some really interesting discussion. As I've been kind of listening over the last 50 minutes or so, I've been scribbling some ideas down that I've heard as someone who's supporting teachers and leaders to adapt their curriculum. And some of the key themes that I think we've covered in this conversation. The first one is this really nice idea that Helen, you talked about, which was about the idea about being really clear about purpose. And Andy, you alluded to this as well when you were talking about it not just being the what, but the why as well. You know, mandating particular curriculum approaches can lead to a kind of loss of appreciation for subject distinctiveness. And that can lead to, in turn, ineffective kind of pedagogical practices being used for certain subjects. And Helen, I think the point you made around ensuring that our leaders and teachers are crystal clear about how the approach they've decided to take is intended to benefit was a really interesting point. And then whether, you know, it's having the intended impact of that. And you made the point as well about how this kind of strongly correlates with what has been said around the importance of teacher PD and what it means for great online learning. So I thought those were points that I found really interesting from both Helen and you, Andy. I think, you know, a current theme that's come up has obviously been the importance of considering the role of well-being and mental health in the curriculum. I really like the principle you framed, Elliot. You know, when you talked about the importance of vocabulary being a kind of approach that you would take to share so that pupils can actually verbalise how they're thinking and how they're feeling at the moment. I thought that was quite a tangible thing to think about for our audience. And this idea that before anything can be learnt, the primary needs and the learning behaviours need nurturing. So that's something that's key for us to be thinking about at the moment. And then there was this idea around how we can collaborate and work in partnership. I think some of you have alluded to that today. The work-life balance of our school leaders and how we can kind of encourage that. So some really interesting themes that have come up today that I found really fascinating. I think kind of lots of challenge, and thank you all for giving kind of quite complex questions, quite complex answers to complex questions in a very short amount of time. So before we close, I just want to thank all the leaders and teachers who have joined us today. We've had about 270 people join us and listen in, so thank you. I'm especially thankful to our 4 guest speakers for their brilliant and very honest accounts of how they're going to be leading their curriculum going forward. If you're interested in exploring this topic further, we'll be sharing some follow-up reading on our website and our Twitter account as well. And similarly, if you're passionate about curriculum and want to lead and want to lead it more effectively in your school, you might also be interested in Ambition's Curriculum Leaders Programme. It's a curriculum leaders for senior leaders and all those kind of leading curriculum design across their school. And if you want to develop a vision for curriculum across your school or your MAT, which can be rolled out to middle leaders and their teams across all subjects, this is a great course to be signing your curriculum leaders up to. It's designed in alignment with the Ofsted framework, and it's based on the latest thinking and evidence around curriculum design. We've got 10 guiding principles of curriculum design which focus on how pupils learn, and with lots of exemplification, this programme can support you to embed these principles within your school context. Applications will be open for the next cohort over the summer, so do keep out an eye on our website for that. This has been the 5th session of our summer series. If you've enjoyed this session, why not check out the rest of the summer series? Next week, there'll be a roundtable discussion led by 2 of my colleagues, Tom Rees and Jen Barker. They'll be asking the question, what does a pandemic mean for leadership development? And of course, there is the range of summer series that we've already had. There's been lots of questions coming up around assessment and how people are going to measure what pupils have learned. And do go back and have a look at Harry Fletcher Wood's summer series episode where he also talked about that particular topic. Please do let us know what you're up to on Twitter, and have a lovely rest of the afternoon. Thank you again to our panelists for their really deep insights, lots to take away. Have a lovely afternoon.